All right. The second of Blair's laws is that your headline should be a spoiler. And this is somewhat related to the first law, but there's a different emphasis here. And I think both of these points are important, which is why I made it two different laws. So you should have a headline, Blair's law number one, but it should also be a spoiler, law number two, in that it should provide an overview of everything that is to come in your paper if you're writing your thesis in your introduction or in a particular section, in that the headline of that section should spoil the ending for what the reader is going to see in those particular sets of paragraphs. And what I mean by a spoiler is that you should outline who the main actors are or that are involved in a particular section or paragraph, how they're related, and what their significance or consequences. In other words, you essentially want to forecast all the main things that the reader is going to see in a particular section so they can have that in their mind and then understand everything else you say in light of the information that you've already provided, in light of the spoiler you've already given them. Another way to put this is that your headline should give the reader a roadmap of what your paper or section is about, where it's going, and who will be part of its journey, and also where you're going to end up. All right, so you're kind of going to cover the main elements of the story from A to Z in 1 to 2 to 3 sentences. That's going to let the reader know what he or she can expect to see in this section, and they're not going to be surprised about anything, any point that you're going to bring up. And in my experience, what I've found is students tend to write detective stories. And what I mean by that is that students don't tend to talk about how everything in this paper is related or its significance or its consequence until the very end of a particular section. So what should actually be a student's headline is actually just their conclusion. And what this has the effect of is the reader doesn't know why they're reading about something, why it's significant, what they're going to encounter in a particular story, and how all this is related until the very end. Now, if you are taking a creative writing class or writing a novel or writing a mystery, then you do want to leave the reader in suspense all the way till the very end. And that's why we like things like mystery movies and thrillers and things like that, because the end wraps everything up for us and lets us see the big picture. And for books that you would read on the beach, detective story formats are great. For academic works, detective story formats are terrible. Imagine reading a 400-page academic book where it's only on page 399 that the author tells you why this work is significant, right? That's a lot. That's expecting a lot of a reader to make that much progress through a book and actually not understand why they are reading something or how it's significant or the answer to the question, who cares or why should I care about this? And I put down here this example of Rosebud. And if you've seen the movie Citizen Kane, which is an older movie, I think came out in the 1950s or so, it's black and white. Some people regard it as the greatest film ever made. If you've seen the movie, the opening scene is a gentleman on his deathbed and keeps muttering the word Rosebud. And then the movie goes on for 2.5 hours or so. And it's only at the very end that you figure out or are shown what Rosebud is. And it's only at that point, once you learn this, that the entire story is put into context. That is a classic detective story. And again, for works of fiction, that's perfectly fine. But for academic works, you want to do the reverse. You want to spoil the ending right at the beginning so the reader knows, okay, this is why what I'm going to read is important. This is its significance, and this is how I'm going to understand. This is how I should understand what I'm going to see coming my way. So for us, no detective stories. And again, the reason why detective stories are structurally a bad way to set up papers is that the reader has to get all the way to the very end to fully appreciate what you as the writer are trying to say. And that's very taxing for a reader and is requiring a lot of work on their end, which means that you're violating that idea that writing is an act of altruism. So here's an example of both a detective story structure, which is not effective or is not as effective as it could be, and a good spoiler roadmap structure. The detective structure is, here's concept X, and then here is these facts, and then at the very end, you find a talk about how concept X explains these facts. And so here the conclusion is actually the thesis. In contrast, the good way to go, the way you want to structure this, is concept X explains these facts A, B, and C. So here, my conclusion from here is my thesis here. I'm spoiling the ending. Then I'll explain how and why concept X does explain these facts. All right, so I'm forecasting what I'm going to do. Now I'm doing it. And then in my conclusion, I'm just going to restate what I've already done. So forecast what you're going to do it, then restate what you've done. All right. Now, the reason why people often write detective stories is because when you are writing, you are figuring out how exactly, in this case, this concept would explain these facts. And it's only after you've kind of talked about this stuff that you really have a good handle on how everything comes together. And that's fine. That's natural. You are going to learn in kind of a detective structure format. Again, it's fine. It's completely natural. All you need to do then is once you get here, you take what is your conclusion here, you make it your thesis here, and then you go through and make sure you're actually explaining how all these things work, and then you're just going to restate your thesis. So you're going to learn in this way, but you want to write this way. And what this means is, as you are learning, once you get to what is your conclusion, once you see how everything comes together, which will tend to be at the end of a section, just cut and paste that and throw that and make that your first 1 to 2, 3 sentences that will provide the context so the reader can appreciate everything else you see in this particular section. All right, so the spoiler or roadmap or your thesis, so just state what the topic of your paper or your section, but you should identify the main actors, how they're related, and what's the significance about why you're talking about them. So identify the actors, identify how they're related, and then give the reader a sense of their significance or consequence. Right? Try to answer the question of like, who cares or why, as a reader, should I devote my time to invest my time in reading this paper or this section of a paper? If you can answer those questions right at the get-go, then you're setting yourself, that's a very effective way to set up the structure for your paragraph and makes the reader's life a lot easier. Now, here's an example of a bad spoiler. In this paper, I'm going to talk about Marx's idea of exploitation in the context of a capitalist economy. Now, to be fair, I'm identifying probably the two main actors here, the idea of exploitation and capitalism. But I'm not talking at all about how these two things are related. I'm just saying I'm bringing them both up, but I'm not talking about how they're related. Do these go hand in hand with one another? Are the exact opposites of one another? Does one cause the other? Right? Does the other cause this one? I have no sense of the relationship between these two things. And there's also no context given about the significance of why these ideas are being brought up. So a much more effective spoiler in this case would be something like this. In this paper, I'm going to talk about Marx's idea of exploitation in the context of the capitalist economy and show how and why he thinks capitalism is an inherently exploitative system. So in that last part of the sentence there, I've talked about how these concepts are related to each other. And then, as will be seen, Marx is concerned about exploitation because he thinks it results in the destitution of workers and creates an ever-widening gulf between workers and owners. And in this sentence, I'm giving the reader a sense of why this is significant, or at least I'm giving the reader a sense of why Marx thinks this relationship between capitalism and exploitation is significant in his eyes. So you want your headlines to look something like this. I'm identifying the main actors, talking about how they're related to one another, and then giving the reader a sense of the consequence or the significance of why we're talking about these things.